Chapter 9. So what are we going to be talking about in Chapter 9? So we're going to be talking about land use regulations and environmental issues. There's a couple things that we're going to be talking about too. We're going to be talking about also government powers. So let's talk mostly right now about some land use regulations and understand this, that there are private and, again, government powers. Private land use controls, they're basically restrictions or limitations on the extent of your ownership. So we talked about ownership in Chapter 5, when we talked about the bundle of rights, okay? And these are restrictions on those bundle of rights when you own real estate. One of them is deed restriction. So what's a deed restriction? So deed restriction is something that runs appurtenant, which means with the property. So deed restrictions run appurtenant, and they're placed on the property by private parties, okay? They are usually containing a restrictive covenant of some sort, but they cannot be in violation of a law or discriminatory. So a lot of deed restrictions that you'll see sometimes actually are illegal in their discrimination. So you'll see a lot in the South that there are deed restrictions that have to do with race. You'll see that cannot sell this home to a Negro, cannot abide by that deed restriction. That is a violation of the law. Okay, Civil Rights Act of 1866. So mainly one of them, but there are others that is in violation of as well. So the restriction cannot be in violation of the law. Okay. It also sometimes might have time limitations on it. It might say that a lot of times commercial properties have time limitations where you cannot have a sub shop here, because let's say the owner was a sub shop and they now want to sell it and they want to move somewhere else. They might have a restrictive covenant on it. They cannot be in sub shop for 2-3 years. Now, does that affect market value? Yeah. And if you haven't already taken a look at the appraisal chapter, you'll understand we discuss market value, and that, two things can be true at the same time. It can be perfectly fine for you to place that time limitation or restriction on the property if you're selling it, such as that, but it could affect value. So those two things could be true, okay? Deed restrictions usually in townhome communities, condominium communities, any kind of PUD where they might want to have some sort of uniform to the exterior of the property, or uniform in regards to what you can and cannot do with the property, so that there's no type of lack of conformity, because conformity in those developments are typically something that needs to happen for there to be a cohesive development. Okay, you can't have someone going out there doing some crazy wackadoo stuff with their property. Sometimes they're silly, like the no basketball hoops in the driveway, and that's part of things that they put in the covenants and restrictions on the development. That's usually when you will see the private land use restrictions, okay, deed restrictions. And they can be enforced by anyone by going to a court of law. And the remedy is to revert the property to the use that would abide by the deed restriction, okay? The deed restriction must be honored and followed. Now let's talk a little bit about police powers, government powers that we have. So I'm going to go one by one on this one, because these are things that you do need to know. So definitely perk your ears up a little bit. These are things you need to know. First one is police power. So if there's a guy running through a neighborhood going yard to yard to yard in a police chase, okay, the police have the power to do law enforcement things, to go onto your property. They do not need your permission if it's lawful and things like that. If they want to have a search warrant, if there is a disturbance and they need to access your property, they're going to do that. They're going to access your property. They're going to be able to use it for whatever means they need to, okay? And they're not going to ask you your permission on that one. Next thing that we have right here is eminent domain. eminent domain. So what is eminent domain? Great question. Eminent domain is when the government takes a property, okay, takes a property for a higher and greater public use, okay? Now, that higher and greater public use could be a variety of things, and they take it through the process of condemnation, okay? They will condemn the property, and they do have to give fair market value. Now, there you can read some eminent domain cases in which you might argue one way or another that they didn't give fair market value, or there's some issues. Typically, eminent domain is a very broad stroke of the pen in regards to how the law is written, and that's because they really kind of have to have it that way, because sometimes they might need to exercise eminent domain for infrastructure. They might need to use it for rezoning. There might be a project that needs to be done. So there's a lot of different things, reason why they cannot have specificity when it comes to that law. So there's more of a broad stroke of the pen when it comes to eminent domain. And again, the other key word that you want to tag with eminent domain is when the government will exercise the right of condemnation. They will condemn the property, okay? So that is eminent domain. Escheat is the next one, escheat. So if you die intestate is without a will, okay? And you die intestate, and there are no next of kin, your property will escheat to the state. The state will take ownership of the property. Okay, so escheat is another one of our government powers. Next is taxation. Do I need to explain what taxation is? I don't think I do. You guys are smart. Now, we won't really go into the public municipal land uses, but actually, you know what? Let's talk a little bit about public use, land use, things like that, because we'll talk about the different zoning, and we'll talk about a non-conforming use and things of that nature in a zoning variance. So, municipal governments have local master plans. They have some land use controls, zoning. They'll usually the word you will hear is zoning. Okay. Is this zone commercial? Is this zone residential? Is this zone to have this? Excuse me. What's the setback lines? What's the how much of the property can be improved? All of that is usually your municipal governments. Okay. Municipal governments can set a certain side of the town and say that is a residential area. Now, let's say that there was a local drugstore there. Okay, just an old family drugstore. And then now they zoned it residential. So you cannot build any commercial properties there anymore. Can the old family drugstore still operate? Yes. It is grandfathered in. It is grandfathered in, and it will be called a non-conforming use. Okay, non-conforming use. So if it is grandfathered in, existing, non-conforming use. Now, let's say it's an area of all residential, and someone said, hey, I want to put a family pharmacy in because I think that there's a need for it. It will go to the municipal zoning board, and they will make their case for it, and they will ask for a variance. There's other types of variances, too, if you want to improve on more of the property than the township allows you to, things of that nature. That is called the variance. So if you are grandfathered into the zoning regulations, you have a non-conforming use. If you are looking to have an exception made to you, that would be considered a zoning variance. A zoning variance, okay? Those are the two differences there. Okay. Next thing that we want to do is talk about environmental issues. Okay, environmental issues. Okay. Now, there are some genuine concerns when it comes to certain types of environmental issues, and we're going to go through a bunch of different ones. Now, there is one that you do need to know in regards to whether you have to have some sort of language or anything given to any of your clients, if there's something that you need to do. So that would be the second one right on here, which is lead-based paint. If you sell a home that was built prior to 1978, home built prior to 1978, you must give a DEP booklet to the client, and you must have on file a disclosure from the seller saying if they have any reports or knowledge of lead-based paint in the home. What is the norm? Typically, the seller says, I do not have any knowledge, I do not have any reports. But if they did go through with a report or testing of some sort, they must disclose that, yes, we had it tested and here were the results. Okay? Lead-based paint. So I'll start there because I kind of went right into it. What is lead-based paint? So lead-based paint was very common prior to the early 80s. It was really stopped using like 1975-ish, okay? But lead-based paint is not hazardous if you touch it, not hazardous if you work on it. However, where does it become hazardous? Lead-based paint becomes hazardous if it chips off and is ingested. So if it is either ingested through the lungs, okay, or by eating it, okay, so a lot of the times there were kids who were eating chips of paint that would fall onto the floor, things like that, okay? So lead-based paint is only hazardous if you ingest. Now let's go back up to asbestos. What is asbestos? What is asbestos? Asbestos is an amazing, magical material. It is an amazing insulator. So back in the day, it was used highly in tile, siding, pipe insulation, really used a lot. Asbestos has similar issues, similar issues to lead-based paint. It's friable. It's friable. So what happens is that means that it's crumbly. When I say friable, spelled F-R-I-A-B-L-E. Friable. If asbestos flakes off and gets into the air, becomes airborne, okay, it could be ingested through the lungs and it could be very hazardous, okay? Asbestos is very hazardous if ingested, okay? So if you see, and it usually has like an orange tint to it, if you see something like that, you do not want to touch it, okay? Not want to touch it. Radon. Radon. It is a radioactive, naturally occurring gas that is odorless, colorless, okay, and comes from the ground soil, okay? So what happens is usually if a home so if a home's been built past about 1995, they probably have it pre-fitted with a radon system in it. It just would need a fan venting it out. And what happens is radon system, how you know that if you have that pipe is obviously it was built past 1995, but also if you see like a PVC pipe in your basement or in your crawl space that has the word radon on it. So what happens is there's usually an inactive system in every home that is built, because if there is at some point radon found, because it is naturally occurring, there is no rhyme or reason as to whether you'll have high radon or low radon. There's some areas that are more known for it. But what is high radon? So let me tell you what high radon is. High radon would be anything that would test for picocuries per liter or higher. The test for radon is usually activated charcoal. So what is activated charcoal? The inside of a Brita filter. They just leave that out somewhere where it's usually the lowest point in the house. They'll usually put it in the basement, first floor. They'll ask that the windows be closed so that there's nothing else that really escapes, and they get kind of a good reading as to what the concentration of the radon is, if any, in the home. Because obviously if you leave the windows open, do things like that, they won't be able to get they won't be able to see the true concentration levels, okay? So what happens is that will activate charcoal basically sucks up everything that's in there. Like I said, it's a Brita filter, okay? It's exactly what it is the inside of a Brita filter. And then what they do is they test that activated charcoal for how much picocuries per liter the radon is present, okay? Anything 4 or above would need to have an active system in place, where what they would basically do is take that pre-fitted system and put a fan in it. That's about $500. It's usually not too cheap, not too expensive. It's usually a pretty simple fix, and it's actually foolproof. It just takes whatever's going on in the bottom of the, whatever is naturally occurring, and just sucks it right out, pushes it out to the side of the house. Because what happens is it safe? So why is it not safe in the house and it's safe outside the house? Well, because what happens is the concentration level outside of the house much lower. So what happens is if radon's naturally occurring, we're probably walking around in areas where there's radon all the time. The hazard is when radon is encapsulated in a home and there is a high concentration of it. That's when it is not good. Urea formaldehyde, not used anymore. It was an insulator used between walls. Urea formaldehyde, really, as long as it's left untouched, should be fine. But if you have urea formaldehyde in a home, you might want to get that tested and have remediation done. Mold. If it's damp, if it's moist, you might get moisture, you might get mold on it. There are many, many types of strains of mold. I do not recommend that you touch mold. You disturb mold, because mold also becomes airborne, just kind of like asbestos. Like, don't touch it. Do not touch mold, okay? There are certain types that grow on different things. So there's mold that grows on sheetrock. There's mold that grows on rubber. There's many, many different strands. So this is really something that you should be contacting a specialist to help you with that if there are concerns of mold, okay? Carbon monoxide. I'm sure that you guys know, seen, heard, know what it is. It's something that you do want to have carbon monoxide alarms in your house, because that could be very deadly, and it could be very deadly at nighttime, and it's kind of like a silent killer. That is something that you really want to make sure that you have carbon monoxide alarms that are working. Electromagnetic fields. You could read a study that says that they are good for you. You could read a study that says that they are bad for you. You could read a whole bunch of different things, okay? But I will tell you this. It all depends on what your predisposition is to this. Some people don't want to be near high tension wires, have concerns about this. I get it. I understand. I don't necessarily agree, but I get it, okay? Also, there are no proven studies, okay, where the government has gotten involved and said, hey, okay, these are the regulations that you need. Next thing would be underground storage tanks, so like oil tanks underground, things of that nature. Again, no regulations with these, but underground storage tanks, if you do see signs of it, you can have a sweep done, which tests for metal anomalies in the ground, okay, where there would be an oil tank or something like that. If you do find one, again, there are no regulations that say that you need to pull it out of the ground, but what do most people do? Most people have it pulled out of the ground. So the process is that they will probably take core samples and test if there's any kind of contamination with the soil around it. If there's no contamination, probably good to go, not an issue, not a concern, not a problem. But if there are concerns in regards to contamination, there might be additional testing that you would need before you pull the tank out of the ground, okay? But that's typically what happens with the oil tanks. Other types of underground storage would be that of a leach field with septic systems or well systems, and those have their own unique testing and things like that. But again, all individual, and what I would say with all of this, if you have further questions, always seek a professional's advice and help before you give any of your own advice. I am very well versed in a lot of this, and I still tell my clients, please make sure that you are seeking the advice of a professional before you make a decision if this is the right move for you and your family. Okay? So with that, that's chapter 9.